Hello. Today's scripture reading is from the 10th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, verses 24 through 39. And the text reads, "A disciple is not above the teacher, nor a slave above the master. It is enough for the disciple to be like the teacher and the slave like the master. If they have called the master of the household Beelzebul, how much more will they malign those of his household? So have no fear of them, for nothing is covered up that will not be uncovered, and nothing secret that will not become known. What I say to you in the dark, tell in the light, and what you hear whispered, proclaim from the housetops. Do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father. And even the hairs of your head are all counted. So do not be afraid. You are of more value than many sparrows. Everyone, therefore, who acknowledges me before others, I also will acknowledge before my Father in heaven. But whoever denies me before others, I also will deny before my Father in heaven. Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and one's foes will be members of one's own household. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever does not take up the cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life will find it." I can see no way around it. I must begin today's message on a sobering note. Now, I know there is enough going on in the world, and I don't need to bombard you with any more depressing words or dire warnings, but I can see no way around it once considering this text. Let me first begin by saying something that I think most, if not all, Christians can or should get behind. Do we not all agree that the way of Jesus leads to life? When Jesus says, "I am the way," we should not reduce this to some narrow doctrine about the details pertaining to his person. Rather, we should interpret this to mean that Jesus embodies the ways of God as they might manifest in humanity. So, you have Jesus speaking into his culture and in his times, offering a different perspective or a different way of living in human community. You have the values of Rome on one hand, which are peace through military conquest, prosperity through exploitation of certain people groups, worship of the emperor as if he were the image of the divine, this sort of nationalist religion. In fact, Caesar represented a certain form of self-worship, really. In worshiping the emperor, you are really worshiping yourself, your values, and your highest ideation of yourself and your nation. It's a kind of idolatry, the idolatry of self-worship. So Jesus comes along and he says, no. Now, he used more words than that, but basically he said no to the whole thing. He said of Rome's violence, "Turn the other cheek and pray for those who persecute you, and that those who live by the sword die by the sword." More on that in a little bit, because we did just read that Jesus came not to bring peace, but the sword. He meant something different, and again, we'll touch on that in a second. But he said, as it relates to warfare, those who live by the sword die by the sword. He said of Rome's reckless pursuit of wealth, "Beware, we do not live by the abundance of our possessions." He even went so far as to tell a rich man, when that rich man asked him how he might inherit eternal life, he said, "Sell all you have and give it to the poor, then your soul will be free. And of course, that man being embedded in his culture and enamored with his culture's values left that interchange sad. As to the cult of the emperor, Jesus would serve it as a threat to that cult, so much a threat to the system that the religious elite and the Roman officials would converge and cooperate and kill Jesus in an attempt to silence a voice that they found threatening. So now I'm just setting you up for the sobering part, the part that I talked about from the onset. Jesus' death can seem so far removed from us. After all, it's 2,000 years old. But the opening words of today's text teach us that we are not so far removed from the threat of violence as we would like to believe as disciples of Jesus. Hear again the words, verse 24 of chapter 10. A disciple is not above the teacher, nor a slave above the master. It is enough for the disciple to be like the teacher and the slave like the master. If they have called the master of the house of Beelzebul, how much more will they malign those of his household? Now, of course, you have the language of master and slave in there, which was part and parcel for the time, and I would want to add a parenthetical insert to say that I would look for a better analogy for our times. But to paraphrase what he's basically saying there, if you are a disciple of Jesus, why should you be expected to be treated any better than the one you've chosen to follow? Jesus says, even if they brand me a devil, or in this case, Beelzebul, a devil, even if they brand me a devil, how much worse will it be for my household, for those who follow me, for my kin, those of kindred spirit? In other words, you and me. What he's trying to say is that those who follow Jesus will remain just as much of a threat to the order of things as Jesus ever was. Which means if you are floating along rather comfortably in your time and in your culture, you might want to re-examine your values and your priorities. Jesus was a threat to the order of things, so we can expect similar consequences. And this sets the stage for what follows. Jesus says, in spite of this, have no fear. Now you might think, fear? What do I have to fear? I really don't understand. Wait for it. If you are speaking into the current order of things, decrying greed, decrying exploitation, calling into question the idols of a nation that in large part worships its own image, you aren't going to make very many friends, at least friends with those who benefit by the current order of things. So if you're waiting for the shoe to drop, and if you're living right, wait. I can remember the first time I suggested that for many, disrespecting the American flag was many times worse than a sin than disrespecting the symbols of our faith. I remember the first sermon I preached where I made the point that many people are so enamored with the Pledge of Allegiance, the national anthem, and the flag that they might cry and be moved to tears upon a heart-rending rendition of one of their favorite patriotic anthems or themes. But then they can listen to the Sermon on the Mount, the heart, the crux of Jesus' teachings, as he describes a different way for us to be. The same person who chokes up during the anthem might hear the Sermon on the Mount and hear it with relative indifference, perhaps even bored, not at all overwhelmed by the implications. I can remember the flack that I took for saying as much in a sermon years ago. I mean, I've preached on some things that I thought were rather controversial, but that really ruffled some feathers. What was I saying? Do you mean that America isn't the jewel of God's eye? What was I doing questioning the assumptions of the most wealthy nation ever to have existed? Then I'd preach another sermon another Sunday, and I'd say something like, well, let me tell you what Jesus said about wealth and a love of wealth. Let me tell you the parable of that rich farmer who, instead of giving his surplus crops to the poor, did as any sensible business person would have done. He built bigger and better barns to store the grain. It was a bumper crop, and he was going to keep the surplus. But he was called a fool by God, and he died. The end. I preach a sermon on this, and what do I get? Defensiveness. It's as if to question the stated goals of our politicians is to question our very souls. The goal seems to be the acquisition of as much material goods as we can manage. And today, to name our addiction to consumerism is to brand one tenet of our civic religion a heresy. After all, isn't it assumed that one of the rules we live by is an ever-increasing abundance of material goods, and consequently, an ever-increasing abundance of garbage and refuse as we throw out as much as we buy, or then sometimes more. But don't question that. That is one of the pillars of our society. If I name our war economy, the billions made by way of the war machine, billions in profit. It's a very lucrative business, this war making. If I name the exploitation of workers, if I name the way the voices of Christian preachers have been co-opted to provide a theological justification for greed and for violence in our name, well, let's just say, as I've named these things, relationships have been strained. Jesus warned me. I should have known. He writes, or he said in verse 34, "Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword." Wait a minute. Didn't you just quote Jesus in saying that those who live by the sword die by the sword? Why, yes, I did. But here Jesus is talking about a different kind of tension and division. A tension and a division that his message would create. The Prince of Peace knows that a message of peace that threatens the status quo is bound to lead to trouble. For example, when Jesus proclaimed good news to the poor, sight for the blind, freedom for the oppressed, and repair for the brokenhearted, and a year of jubilee in Luke chapter 4, what happened next? The place broke out in a riot. They just couldn't take it. The message of peace was met with resistance and anger and outrage. And before the message leads to peace, it brings out the swords. The modes of opposition that the world held by idolatry are bound to bring. The modes of opposition that a world held in idolatry are bound to bring to a message of peace. The sword is brought out against the message, sometimes metaphorically, sometimes quite literally. Bonhoeffer was martyred. King was shot dead on a balcony in Memphis. Of course, true to form, Jesus was killed. He goes on to say, verse 35, "For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and one's foes will be members of one's own household." This calls to mind awkward gatherings with family and friends. The values we all carry into that space are bound to come out. We start arguing about immigration, gay rights, the plight of the poor, the foreign conflicts that we wage. You know, all the stuff that is easy to talk about. I can remember conversations after the downtown Episcopal Church here in Indianapolis put the nativity scene in a cage as a statement of solidarity with immigrants who were put in cages along our southern border and in other places. This is a very provocative image. Mary, Mother of God, Joseph, Jesus Christ as a baby in a cage, to suggest that Jesus identifies with those who are in cages. After all, did he not say that he came to set the oppressed free? Freedom for the prisoner? This is a signal that Jesus, in his humble humanity and breath, taking divinity, sides with children locked in cages. Either that's true or it isn't. And I'm convinced that we have good reason to suspect that it is. But trust me, in the context of that argument, I am sometimes set against my father, my in-laws, friends and family members alike, and more recently, my congregants, as I've stood with Black Lives in the recent month. And I don't like it. I wish to be a follower of Jesus, and I wish that being a follower of Jesus meant that there would be less conflict between myself and the people that I love. But this does not seem to be the case. Jesus continues, "Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever does not take up the cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it." There you have it. This is the way to life. It is a hard way. Before life, sacrifice. The fracturing of relationships. Before life, a cross. Before finding life, we must be willing to lose our life for the sake of what is most right. It is difficult, and it pits us against those who are captivated by the lures of wealth and the false idols of nationalism. People who you love will not agree. People who you count as your friends will be challenged by the message of Jesus. After all, was not Judas scandalized when a woman wasted costly perfume on the feet of Jesus? Was not the rich man made sad when he was told to sell all that he had and give it to the poor? Didn't the disciples respond to that interchange and what they saw when the rich man went away? Didn't they respond after Jesus said that it's easier for a rich man for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get to heaven? Didn't the disciples say, who then can be saved? It defies the assumptions that we hold, many of us. After Jesus upset the religious elites, did they not tear their robes and call for the death of the alleged heretic that we know as Jesus the Christ? It has always been this way. Why would it be any different for you or for me? Should we actually take the words of Jesus seriously? Why would we expect the world to behave any different? Are we brave enough to face the noise is the question before us. After all, a whole lot is on the line. In fact, Jesus says, "Everyone, therefore, who acknowledges me before others, I also will acknowledge before my Father in heaven. But whoever denies me before others, I also will deny before my Father in heaven." So in so many words, your very soul, your essence, your integrity is at stake. You can compromise your values if you like, but you will lose yourself or your soul. What's important, integral to you, you will lose it in the process. And you will fall off the path that leads to life. The hard, difficult path that leads to a cross, a sacrifice, but to life. The hard way Jesus walks. But here, just when everything seemed so out of line and so depressing, the words of Jesus in the midst of this passage, this hard passage, the words in the midst of this passage provide the disciple great comfort. Verse 26, "So, all things considered, have no fear of them. For nothing is covered up that will not be uncovered, and nothing secret that will not become known." In other words, the truth wins out, and you in spite of the trouble and the hardship, are vindicated. Because God is vindicated. Because God is on the side of justice and love. And if God wins, and if you are on that side, the truth wins out, and you are vindicated. Verse 27, what I say to you in the dark, tell in the light. And what you hear whispered, proclaim from the housetops. So don't be bashful, say it loud. They need to hear this message from the rooftops. Do not fear, verse 28, do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. In short, there are worse things than dying, than ridicule, than angry relatives or friends at dinner parties or on Facebook. To compromise is to lose yourself for a lie, to sell your soul for a lie. Verse 29, are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father. And even the hairs of your head are all counted. So do not be afraid. You are of more value than many sparrows. God will not abandon you. Just as God is with the sparrow, just as God knows you down to the last fiber, you will remain fixed by God's gaze. You will not be abandoned, even as those around you reject you. So, do not be afraid. Stand tall. Stand for what is right. Stand with Jesus as a disciple. You might meet a similar fate, which I remind you is resurrected life on the other side of the worst that the world could throw at him, even death. I've needed reminded of this again and again in recent years. I felt led to take many stances that have put me at odds with many who I hold dear. And it seems that the message of Jesus does divide like a sword brought to a problem. But this is how it's always been, and we can't ever know perfectly what we ought to do, but when we when we feel convicted to do something, we must not be afraid. When we feel convicted to do something in the name of love, truth, peace, and justice, we must not be afraid. The truth will win out in the end, and it would be better to die for the truth than to live defending a lie, or to live dreaming, enamored, delusioned by a culture and its illusions and its spectacle and its fetishizing of wealth and force and might and every other thing. And I believe that the church today is being led to life by way of a fight for racial and economic justice. This is the specifics for today. I believe that what Jesus said about the poor, about wealth, and about caring for the least of these is just as relevant today as it ever was. And I believe that for our nation to have a moral revival, it must be called to task for the ways that our wealth has been built upon, acquired by the exploitation of the vulnerable, upon slaves, upon genocide, as we pushed with westward expansion, the indigenous peoples, not even into the sea, but into their graves, upon the labor today of prisoners who make our stuff for basically nothing, upon the labor of poor in other countries, and upon the labor of poor in our country, and upon the backs of so many. Economic justice and racial justice belong together. And that lack of access to health care for those who lack it is tragic, but very beneficial to the ones who make the rules. It's all connected. And to name it will put you at odds with some people that you love. To name these realities will cause division for sure. I realize that. But I suppose we should have known what we were in for when we decided to walk with Jesus along this path. After all, he did warn, but never fear. Started on a sad note, let's end on a hopeful note. Never fear. Jesus says, for nothing is covered up that will not be uncovered, and nothing secret that will not become known. Tell the truth. Stand up for what is right. While this way leads to the cross, the way of the cross eventually leads us to life. The life of the saints and the martyrs. The lives of the saints and the martyrs testify to this. The way of the cross eventually leads to life. Life, even in spite of fractured relationships, even in spite of the grave. Do not fear. Find life. Walk bravely with Jesus.